talk about 300 years in 4 minutes. Was it ever so apparent we need this dialogue? I wrote a letter to the New York Times recently which didn't get printed, which is getting to be my rapport with the New York Times. They said that it was too personal. What it concerned itself with was I was in a bit of a stew over the stall-in. Because when the stall-in was first announced, I said, oh my God, now everybody's gone crazy, tying up traffic, what's the matter, who needs it? And then I noticed the reaction, starting in Washington and coming on up to New York, among what we're all here calling the white liberal circles, which was something like, you Negroes act right or you're going to ruin everything we're trying to do. And that got me to thinking more seriously about the strategy and the tactic that the stall-in intended to accomplish. And so I sat down and wrote a letter to the New York Times about the fact that I am of a generation of Negroes that comes after a whole lot of other generations. And my father, for instance, who was, real American-type American, successful businessman, very civic-minded and so forth, was the sort of American who put a great deal of money, a great deal of his really extraordinary talents, and a great deal of passion into everything that we say is the American way of going after goals. That is to say that he moved his family into a restricted area where no Negroes were supposed to live, and then proceeded to fight the case in the courts, all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And this cost a great deal of money. It involved the assistance of NAACP attorneys and so on. And this is the way of struggling that everyone says is the proper way to do, and it eventually resulted in a decision against restrictive covenants, which is very famous, Hansberry versus Lee. And that was very much applauded. But the problem is that Negroes are just as segregated in the city of Chicago now as they were then. And my father died a disillusioned exile in another country. That is the reality that I am faced with when I get up and I read that some Negroes my own age and younger say that we must now lie down in the streets, tie up traffic, stop ambulances, do whatever we can, take to the hills if necessary with some guns, and fight back, you see. This is the difference. And I wrote to the Times and said, can't you understand that this is the perspective from which we are now speaking? It isn't as if we got up today and said, what can we do to irritate America? It's because that since 1619, Negroes have tried every method of communication, of transformation of their situation, from petition to the vote, everything. We've tried it all. There isn't anything that hasn't been exhausted. Isn't it rather remarkable that we can talk about a people who were publishing newspapers while they were still in slavery in 1827, you see? They've been doing everything, writing editorials, Mr. Wexler, for a long time, And now the charge of impatience is simply unbearable. I would like to submit that the problem is that, yes, there is a problem about white liberals. I think there's something horrible that Norman Podhoretz, for instance, can sit down and write the kind of trash that he did at this hour. That is to say that a distinguished American thinker can literally say that he is more disturbed at the sight of a mixed couple, or that anti-Semitism from Negroes and anti-Semitism from anybody is horrible and disgusting, and I don't care where it comes from, but anti-Semitism somehow from a Negro apparently upsets him more than it would from a German fascist, you see. This was the implication of what really gets to him. Well, you have to understand that when we are confronted with that, we wonder who we are talking to and how far we're going to go. The problem is we have to find some way with these dialogues to show and to encourage the white liberal to stop being a liberal and become an American radical. I think that then it wouldn't, when that becomes true, some of the really eloquent things that were said before about the basic fabric of our society, which, after all, is the thing which must be changed, you know, to really solve the problem. You know, the basic organization of American society is the thing that has Negroes in the situation that they are in, and never let us lose sight of it. When we then talk with that understanding, it won't be so difficult for people like Mr. Wexler, whose sincerity I wouldn't dream of challenging. When I say to him, his sincerity is one thing, I don't have to agree with his position, but it wouldn't be so difficult then for me to say, when someone uses the term Cold War liberal, that it is entirely different, you see, the way that you would assess the Vietnamese War and the way I would, because I can't believe that anyone who is given what an American Negro is given, you know, our viewpoint, can believe that a government which has at its disposal a Federal Bureau of Investigation which cannot ever find the murders of Negroes, and by that method and shows that it cares really very little about American citizens who are black, really are over somewhere fighting a war for a bunch of other colored people, you know, several thousand miles. You just have a different viewpoint. This is why we want the dialogue, to explain that to you. See, it isn't a question of patriotism and loyalty. My brother fought for this country, my grandfather before that, and so on. That's all a lot of nonsense when we criticize. The point is that we have a different viewpoint because we've been kicked in the face often, and the vantage point of Negroes is entirely different. And these are some of the things we're trying to say. I don't want to go past my time. Thank you. I, for one, would like to identify my position. Radicalism is not alien to this country, neither black nor white. And we have a very great tradition of white radicalism in the United States. And I've never heard Negroes boo the name of John Brown. With white kids on the firing line in Mississippi as we're sitting. So there's no problem, no matter how excited we get. I think ultimately anybody at this table who wants to read any patriot out of the Negro movement, it's not the point. Some of the first people who have died so far in this struggle have been white men. And I, for one, would be prepared, I must say, in exception to anything said, to accept the leadership of a person who gives that much devotion as against someone who would exhibit the traitorous characters of say, a Moise Tshombe. I don't think that we can decide ultimately on the basis of color that kind of thing. The passion that we express should be understood, I think, in that context. We want total identification. It's not a question of reading anybody out. It's a merger, but it has to be a merger on the basis of true and genuine equality. And if we think that it isn't going to be painful, we're mistaken. Just one thing I wanted to allude to, I think as the movement goes on, we each see our place and we get into it. You know. I know that you, for instance, are an admirer of our late president, and he presumed, with all respect to the dead, but he happens to have been our president, so I have to talk about him that way, to have suggested to the world that if our foreign policy were not honored with regard to Cuba, that we would blow up the world, you see. And we live in a nation where everything which is talked about is talked about in terms of the fact that we are going to be the mightiest, the toughest, the roughest cats going, in the whole world. And when a Negro says something about, I'm tired, I can't stand it no more, I want to hit somebody, you say that we're sitting here panting and ranting for violence, It's not right. I think it's very simple that the question of the whole idea of debating whether or not Negroes should defend themselves is an insult. If anybody comes and does ill in your home or your community, obviously you try your best to kill them. My name is Lorraine Hansberry. I'm a writer. I think you know that I am your neighbor in Croton, and I'm very proud of our community. I understand we have more than 100 people outside today. And it's my privilege to be the chairman of this meeting this afternoon, which has assembled all of us here in response to an extraordinary mood in our country, to a very great mood in our country, one which now presumes to finish up the unfinished business of American life, the disgraceful unfinished business of American life, a mood which dares to present to the American people as a whole the fact that while it is proper, as I always do, to observe that there really is no such thing as the new Negro, and I am always emphatic about it because, among other things, I try to be something of an amateur student of Negro history. And there hasn't been a period in the history of this country, or for that matter the New World, when the Negro people have not fought valiantly, persistently, for their freedom. As one person said, it is not particularly new that Negroes are now determined to fight for their voting rights throughout the South. What is new is that the atmosphere in the world is so completely different that the solution that the racists used to apply at will, which was simply to drop the insurgents into the local rivers around Dixie, is now different. A new world. And the responsiveness of our people to that fact is the thing I think that draws all of us here this afternoon. The responsiveness of the people of Birmingham and Jackson and throughout the South, and representatives of which we have with us this afternoon. Finally, I think we are all, if not to the point of exhaustion, heard of the meeting that some people, myself among them, had with the Attorney General of the United States not too long ago. And there were many references that became famous on that occasion. One of them that I'm proud to say, since it was my remark, had significance then, and I'm going to repeat it. Most of us there felt was the telling statement. It was when, during the genuine heat of the discussion, and our speaker today, Mr. Jerome Smith, had indicated to the Attorney General that the passion and the absence of patience of a sorely oppressed Native American people is beyond anything that we can sit around and be polite about anymore, that the Attorney General exhibited some impatience. And it was at that juncture, and feeling free, that I was speaking for every single Negro and indeed white ally in that room, as there were, that I suggested that the Attorney General re-examine his impatience, because while there might be in that room some of the celebrated figures of whom we all know, the qualitative change in the struggle for Negro freedom was that we are not remotely interested in the old insulting concept of the exceptional Negro. We are not remotely interested in any tea at the White House. that what we are interested in is making perfectly clear that between the Negro intelligentsia and the Negro middle class and the Negro this and that we are one people, and as far as we are concerned, we are represented by the Negroes in the streets of Birmingham.
Young people speak today with a candor that's quite new in the world. If after all the ambition in life is merely to be rich, then all that might threaten that possibility is much to be avoided, is it not? This means, therefore, not incurring the disfavor of employers. It means, how can one protest against the possibility of war if one expects to draw one's livelihood, as an engineer say, from the aircraft industry? How can one write plays which have either implicit or explicit in them a quality of detestation of such commerciality, if in fact one is beholden to the commerciality of the professional sphere? How can one even protest the criminal persecution of political dissenters if one has already discovered at 19 that it is safer not to do so? How indeed can one have the deepest, most profound moral outrage about the fact of the condition of the Negro people in the United States when one has it dinned into one's ears day after day that the only reason why perhaps that troublesome and provocative group of people must someday be permitted to buy a cup of coffee or rent an apartment or get a job is not because of the recognition of the universal humanity of the human race, but because of all the disgraceful things in the world. It happens to be of extremely expedient international politics to grant these things. As I stand here, I know perfectly well that such institutions as the House Committee and all the other little committees has dragged on its particular obscene theatrics for all these years, not to expose communists or do anything really in connection with the security of the United States. They have done it merely to create an atmosphere where, in the first place, I would not come here tonight at all, and second of all, that I would not say what I am going to say, which is, I think that my government is wrong. I would like to see them turn back our ships in the Caribbean. The Cuban people, to my mind, and I speak only for myself, have chosen their destiny. And I don't happen to think that someone brought up in the traditions of our country that it is the place of the descendants of the American Revolution who never asked anybody for permission to become a republic to now interfere in that fact of life any place in the world. Still speaking only for myself and exercising this right, I would go so far, speaking as a Negro in America, to impose a little of what Negroes say all the time to each other, to you. But not only might they turn back the ships, but turn to the affairs of our country that need a righting. And for one thing, empty the legislative and judicial chambers of the victims of political persecution so that we know why that lamp is burning out there in Brooklyn. And while they're at it, go on and help fulfill the American dream and empty the Southern jails where the genuine heroes, practically the only last vestige of dignity that we have to boast about at this moment in our history. That we let those students out of the jails, which is part of our national disgrace at this moment, that this is where young people have to go to ensure what is already on the books. And I would go so far, perhaps it was an over-sense of drama, but not so maybe, and suggest that maybe, without waiting for another 2 men to die in any place in the South, that we send some of those troops on the way to the Caribbean now to finish the reconstruction in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and every place else where the fact of our national flag flying creates the false notion that what happened at the end of the Civil War was the defeat of the Slavocracy. And I say not merely in behalf of the black and oppressed, but for a change, and more thoughtful Negroes have to begin to make this point, but for the white and disinherited of the South, for the poor whites of the South, who by the millions have been made the tragic and befuddled instruments of their own oppression at the hands of the most sinister political apparatus. I think perhaps if our government would do that, it would not have to compete in any wishful way for the respect of the new black and brown nations of the world. Finally, I think that all of us who are thinking such things exercise this right that we're talking about tonight and say them to my fellow artists, paint them, sing them, all of the things that are not currently fashionable to do. Otherwise, all else happens, in my opinion, to be idle and luxurious simplicity and no other thing. I personally agree with those who say that from here on in, if we are to survive, we the people, still an excellent phrase, we the people, have to oblige all the heads of all governments responsible to us, the world's people. I think that it is imperative to say no to all of it, no to war of any kind, anywhere. And I think, therefore, it is imperative to remove from the American fabric any and all such institutions or agencies such as the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which are designed expressly to keep us from saying no. Thank you.
As we all know, the most exciting and purposeful events which are occurring in our country are those which involve the efforts of the Negro people of the United States to wrest their birthright of full citizenship from a laggard and oppressive nation. It is, contrary to the myth, an old struggle. There is, in fact, no such thing as the new Negro, if by that term we are made to understand that the present militant surge of the Negro people is without historical precedent. I make a point of saying this everywhere. It seems to need a great deal of emphasis. After all, even though it's not as well known as it should be, the Negro people have sustained one of the most heroic resistances to tyranny in the history of man. Our African ancestors came to the New World, fighting slavery by mutiny on the high seas and by suicide. The very character of slavery in the United States was defined by the black man's repudiation of his enslavement, which he daily did battle with by sabotage, work stoppage, acts of violence against those who enslaved him, and of course, most telling of all, by running away by the thousands from slavery. And when the time came to help give the fatal blow to the slave system, Negroes now by the tens of thousands fell into the ranks of Abraham Lincoln's Union Army to serve in any way they could to destroy that hideous cancer against human dignity that was the Confederacy. Black folk in America had historically regarded education with reverence. Every moment that could be spared, the ex-slave begged and harassed his liberator to teach him the alphabet. Beyond that, I suppose it required some intimacy with the cultural tradition and folkways of Negroes to know of the esteem in which education is held. All the more poignant and ugly, then, that the withholding of education has been one of the prime instruments of the oppressors of American Negroes. Oppressors who have seen to it that when education could not be entirely withheld, that it could certainly be made substandard. I am, for instance, the product of a Jim Crow grade school. One result of that fact is that to this day I cannot count properly. This despite the fact that my reading scores as a grammar school pupil supposedly reflected the capability of the exceptional or so-called gifted child. Apparently something had to suffer. I was given, during the grade school years, 1/2 of the amount of education prescribed for each child by the Board of Education of my city. This was so because the children of the Chicago ghetto were jammed into a segregated school system. To this day, I do not add, subtract, or multiply with ease. Our teachers, devoted and indifferent alike, had to sacrifice something to make that system work at all. And in my case, it was arithmetic, which got put aside most often. Thus, the man which was able to grasp the university-level reading materials in the 6th and 7th grade had not been sufficiently exposed to elementary arithmetic to make even simple change on grocery store errors. This is what we mean when we speak of the scars, the marks that the ghettoized child carries through life. To be imprisoned in the ghetto is to be forgotten at best, or to have one's birthright deliberately cheated at worst. Equipment, books, actual building space are all cut back on when it comes to the ghetto child. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. I'm speaking of what was not then an old building. On the contrary, it was a relatively new and modern building. It had been built that way purposefully, without adequate facilities. Its substandard quality had been planned from the drawing board. From its inception, it had been earmarked as a ghetto school, a school for Negro children, and therefore one in which as many things as possible might be safely thought of as expendable. After all, that's why the building was built. That's why the ghetto itself was and is maintained not to give education, but to withhold as much as possible. Just as the ghetto exists not to give people homes, but to cheat them out of as much decent housing as possible. If one is really to speak of the hatefulness of the oppressive system under which Negroes live, then no matter how much one despairs to confront such facts, one must. For at this moment, the paramount crime in the United States is the refusal of its ruling classes to admit or acknowledge in any way the real scope and scale and character of the oppression of Negroes. Well, that oppression is not a random, helter-skelter, hit or miss matter of discrimination here and there against people who just happen to be a different color. It's not that at all. It is, as that ruling class perfectly well knows, a highly concentrated, universal, and deliberate blanket of oppression pulled tightly and securely over 20 million citizens of this country. This matter of admitting the true nature of a problem before setting about rectifying it is of utmost importance. It can not only save a great deal of suffering on the part of Negroes, but it could also save considerable embarrassment on the part of the rulers of this nation. Well, that is what their present course has been destined for, the gravest embarrassment. As we all know, there is something which we may call the civil rights game, which goes on in this country, and it's being played right now in Washington. It is a game in which individuals, and indeed whole classes of individuals, who are in every way imaginable committed to the perpetuation of the oppression of Negroes, pretend for a whole variety of fashionable reasons that they are not. A portion of those who play this game go so far as to pretend that not only are they against the present condition of Negroes, but they should like to alter that condition for the better, and according to the rules of the game, they are designated by their co-players as civil rights champions. And depending on what is happening on a given day, they debate with one another on the best methods of stalling Negro demands for equality while appearing to be laboring in behalf of Negro equality. Naturally, whenever Negroes assert that their situation is intolerable, these game players point to the game which is going on and say that if those Negroes do not shut up, they will stop playing altogether and reveal their true sentiments with regard to Negro freedom, which of course would be one of the healthiest things that could happen in this not so healthy country. That is why I've come here this evening to celebrate with you the recognition of the fact that there is only one place from which that desperately needed pressure on the game is going to come from when all is said and done. And it's going to come from 20 million discontented black people who, however, must be led by a new and presently developing young black leadership. A leadership which must absolutely, if the present revolt is to turn into a revolution, become sophisticated in the most advanced ideas abroad in the world. A leadership which will have had exposure to the great ideas and movements of our time. A Negro leadership which can throw off the blinders of parochialism and bathe the aspirations of the Negro people in the realism of the 20th century. A leadership which has no illusion about the nature of our oppression and which will no longer hesitate to condemn not only the results of that oppression, but also the true and inescapable causes of it, which of course is the present organization of American